In 1908, only about 50 heath hens were left. People stepped in, protected them, and within 7 years their population had climbed to roughly 2,000. It looked like the extinction had been stopped. Then everything went wrong until just one bird remained. His name was Booming Ben. The heath hen had once lived along much of America's Atlantic coast, from Massachusetts south toward Virginia. It was a close relative of the greater prairie chicken, and during breeding season, the males put on an unmistakable display, raising feathers on their necks, inflating bright air sacs, and making a deep, booming call. But by the time anyone seriously tried to save them, most of that range was already gone. Hunting had steadily removed birds from the mainland, and local protections did little to stop the decline. By the mid-1800s, the last surviving population was hanging on in Martha's Vineyard, an island off Massachusetts. That left the entire future of the heath hen depending on what happened in one small place. By the 1890s, fewer than 100 heath hens were thought to remain. Then the number dropped even further. Massachusetts stepped in. Hunting was stopped. The remaining birds were guarded. Land on Martha's Vineyard was protected. Predators were controlled, and managers tried to give the birds the best breeding conditions they could. And it worked. By around 1910, the population had climbed to roughly 300. A few years later, estimates were approaching 2,000. For a species that had been down to only a few dozen birds, that was an extraordinary recovery. If you were watching at the time, you could easily have believed the crisis was over. The heath hen had been protected. Its numbers were climbing. The rescue looked like a success. Then, in May 1916, fire swept through its breeding grounds. The timing could hardly have been worse. It was nesting season. A major wildfire burned across parts of Martha's Vineyard, killing some adult birds and destroying eggs and chicks. Then came a severe winter. Goshawks moved through the area and preyed on the survivors. Food and cover had already been damaged. Within a short time, a population that had recently numbered around 2,000 had crashed to a fraction of that. It sounds like we have our answer. Fire destroyed the recovery, except that isn't quite what happened. The heath hen survived, and once again its numbers began to rise. By around 1920, there were several hundred birds on Martha's Vineyard, so even after the fire, winter, and predators, the species still had another chance. The real mystery is what happened next. This time, there was no single disaster you can circle on a calendar. Instead, the problems piled up. Disease was one of them. Blackhead disease, which was associated with domestic poultry, was confirmed in at least one heath hen during the 1920s. Parasites were found as well. Predators continued taking birds from a population that could no longer afford many losses. Cold, wet breeding seasons meant fewer chicks survived, and the balance between males and females was getting worse. That final problem mattered. A population can contain plenty of males and still be in serious trouble if there are too few females producing the next generation. By the late 1920s, that was exactly what was happening. Genetics may also have played a part. When a population gets this small, closely related animals are more likely to breed, and genetic diversity can fall. But there is no need to force the heath hen extinction into one neat explanation. The birds were already facing enough problems. The important point is that each setback was hitting a population that had very little room left to absorb it. The conservationists knew the situation was getting worse. They did not simply give up. Some heath hens were moved from Martha's Vineyard to Long Island in an attempt to establish another population. It failed. Birds were also taken into captivity, and attempts were made to breed them there. That failed too. Those efforts are easy to judge with a century of hindsight, but wildlife conservation was still a young field. There were no modern captive breeding programs, no genetic management plans, and far less experience moving endangered animals between protected populations. They were learning while the heath hen was disappearing, and every failed experiment came with a cost. A bird moved away from Martha's Vineyard with a bird that was no longer breeding there. That was the weakness the earlier recovery had never fixed. The number of heath hens had increased, their security had not. There was still no second healthy population waiting somewhere else if Martha's Vineyard suffered another bad year. By early 1927, only around 13 heath hens remained. 11 were males, just 2 were females. Then the females disappeared. By 1928, only a couple of males were left. Soon there was one. His name was Booming Ben. For years, Ben continued returning to the traditional breeding grounds. He still performed the display his species had performed for generations. He raised his neck feathers, inflated his air sacs, boomed across the heath, and waited. But there were no females left to answer him. By then, protecting Ben could only protect an individual. It could no longer save the species. Birdwatchers and conservationists continued watching for him. Everyone understood what he represented. Then, in March 1932, Booming Ben was seen for the last time. After that, he disappeared. Searchers found nothing. There was no witnessed final death, no exact moment when somebody could say the heath hen was now extinct. There was simply a last sighting, and then an empty breeding ground. Before the verdict, if you're enjoying the case, hitting the like button helps more people find these stories. So how did the bird that had apparently been saved still disappear? The first rescue really did work. Protection stopped the immediate slide toward extinction and pushed the population from around 50 birds to roughly 2,000. But the heath hen had already lost almost its entire original range before the recovery began. Then came fire, severe weather, predators, disease, poor breeding seasons, and a growing shortage of females. None of them needs to carry the whole blame. Together, they were enough. So, the verdict is, human-driven initial decline? Confirmed. Hunting had already reduced a once widespread bird to its final refuge. Conservation recovery? Confirmed. Protection genuinely pulled the heath hen back from the immediate edge. Single final cause? Inconclusive. There was no one event that finished the species. And finally, one population vulnerability, major factor. By the time the rescue began, the heath hen had almost nowhere left to go. That may be the real lesson of Booming Ben. Saving a species is not just about getting its numbers back up. Those animals also need enough habitat, enough breeding success, and enough resilience to survive the next fire, disease outbreak, or terrible year. In 1915, roughly 2,000 heath hens made it look as though extinction had been stopped. 17 years later, there were none. And if you want another story of an American bird that vanished, watch my case on the Carolina parakeet, America's lost native parrot.